I have to tell you, one of my favorite animals, his name is Bruiser. We think he's probably about a 20-year-old iguana. He was found wandering in somebody's front yard in Wake Forest, about an hour from here. And he is the sweetest iguana ever. Like, it's amazing when you get an animal in that's aggressive. Or I had a green cheek conure that was surrendered for biting the snot out of her owner's back. And the only thing with the green cheek was he wants attention. Like, if you if you give him the love and attention, he'll sit there and cuddle on you and groom you all day. And same thing with the iguana. Like, once they're in a comfort zone and that animal blossoms and opens up, and you're like, wow, this is such an amazing creature. Those are the ones that I try to hold on to. The animal that nobody wanted, that we got to socialize or to, recover from this horrific medical thing.
Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today I'm speaking with Grace Danks, who is the owner and founder of the Annwn Animal Sanctuary. Now, Annwn Animal Sanctuary is currently going through a rebrand as I record this episode, so it will be rebranded as simply Wild Discovery. So depending on when you're listening to this episode, that may have already happened, so it will either, in the show notes, will be listed as Annwn Animal Sanctuary or Wild Discovery, or one or the other. This is an exotic animal rescue that Grace runs with her husband, and in some way, this episode is sort of looking under the carpet or into the closet of herpeticulture. This is a dark area of the hobby that we all are very familiar with. We know how much rescues are being overloaded with animals that were impulse purchases that no one wants anymore, sick animals that the keeper can't afford the bill, and so on and so on and so on. And this is not a message directed towards us, people who are listening to this show, because we tend to fall into more of a responsible camp and try our best to make sure animals, if we can't care for them anymore, find their way to a proper home. But of course, there's a huge side of this hobby, this whole retail mammoth side of our hobby, that is pumping out animals into the public that shortly become unwanted, and rescues are there just trying to keep up with this massive demand. So the cool thing about this conversation is Grace is not a person who wants to remove the privilege that we have of keeping exotic animals and specialty animals. She actually is very similar to myself and the message of this podcast, and that's education, helping people understand what the commitment looks like and how to be a responsible keeper. And in this episode, you will learn how big of a heart Grace and her husband have. You cannot imagine spending this much time, money, and energy into a rescue. It's very hard to believe that there are people out there that can actually accomplish this. And we discuss how hard it is to start turning away animals and how expensive it is to run a rescue and many of the issues that come with running a rescue. And it's a fascinating conversation. It's so important that we highlight these areas of the hobby so we can start figuring out ways to mend them. Reptile rescues will always be necessary, but they should not be as necessary as they currently are, and hopefully responsible keepers can kind of take that on as a challenge and hopefully eliminate that over time. Now, if you are enjoying this episode and you enjoy any other episode on this network, you may want to check out animalsathomenetwork.com. There you can find all the show notes for every episode that has been recorded, as well as all the other shows that are on this network. If you would like to join us on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com for as little as $3 a month. There you have early access to episodes. You can communicate with the community on Discord, and it also just helps me keep the lights on here. There's quite a lot of bills. I spend probably about $600 a month operating this podcast. So any little bit of dollars that come towards me to help produce the show is really, really helpful. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. If you are in the market for a new reptile enclosure, make sure you head to the link in the show notes or the description. That is an affiliate link. So if you do make a purchase, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And as you know, you've been following along with my enclosure or my podcast studio makeover that is currently happening and totally sponsored by Custom Reptile Habitats. I know I am due for another video. Maybe by the time you guys are listening to this podcast, I'll have released the video of Winston, my boa enclosure has been completed. I just need to edit it. So hopefully that's out by now. But if not, it will be out soon, and we'll continue on plucking away at this project over the fall. And that is it. Let's jump into this episode. Enjoy. Well, Grace, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm super excited to speak with you today.
I think animal rescues and sanctuaries are such a crucial part of animal keeping. And a lot of times when I conceptualize, especially in the, this podcast is mainly focused on the reptile and amphibian side. And when I think about our industry, our hobby, herpetoculture in general, I think of the rescues as this, it's sort of a safety net for us to collect the collateral damage that we create. I sometimes visualize us as this train that's just driving into the distance and things are falling off it, and then the rescues are these people that are scurrying behind, like trying their best to catch these things. And a lot of times hobbyists just don't give respect to the people who are doing the rescue work, and a lot of times we actually turn a blind eye. And so that's why I want to get into all this with you, and maybe that's the way you feel as well. But why don't we start with how did you get into just animals in general? Have you always been an animal person? Where did your journey start with wildlife?
Yeah, first off, I have to say your analogy is very accurate. One of the better ones I've heard. I've always loved animals. One of the earliest pets I ever had growing up was an iguana in my bedroom. I remember being like 7 or 8 with a pet iguana. Grew up in the country on a farm, so we had cows and pigs, and I was forever catching snakes out in the meadow and frogs and things like that. So always loved animals. And then as a young adult, that transformed into rescue work. So there was always somebody who had a cat or a dog or some sort of animal that they needed some help with or a home for. So really began to take in more animals as an adult. And it wasn't until late 2020 that we kind of pivoted into exotics. So my husband and I moved into our current house July of 2020. We're very blessed. We have about an acre, but we're in this kind of niche area where we're in the county. We're right on the outskirts of the city. So we're not, bound by city laws and regulations for reptiles. And we're also in North Carolina, which is one of the top 4 most liberal states when it comes to owning exotic animals and pets. So there's certainly blessings. We have some great tiger rescues in the state. We don't have anything nearly that large, but you do have some wonderful rescue organizations in the state that focus on very specific types of exotics. Our focus and what we wanted to do was be sort of like your train analogy, sort of a catch-all. As we started kind of opening ourselves up to help the community, we started getting a lot of requests for exotic animals, whether that's a chinchilla or a ferret or a snake or a lizard or whatever that may be. So when we conceptualized the sanctuary, we wanted to focus in on small and exotic animals, really the animals that nobody else would take. So when you think of traditional rescues, it's very much dog and cat. You have some very specific reptile ones. You may have a pig one. But our goal was to take everything as much as we were able to do. So that's kind of what led us to the current rescue.
So when you say you were getting requests for exotics, were you getting people requesting to rescue exotics or people requesting to surrender?
Surrender.
Okay.
There's always 100 times more surrender requests than people to adopt.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And then so before 2020, when you were sort of beginning into this rescue world, was that something you were just doing on a private basis, or was there an organization that you were working with as well?
Nope, it was a private basis. So I've always seemed to attract animals in need, and whether it's a friend at a coffee shop or something like that saying, "Hey, oh my gosh, I've got to move. I can't take my baby," or medical issues for one reason or another. I think I've just always attracted animals in need and happy to do so.
And this is the hard part about being like the type of individual that you are, because I think a lot of times, and not saying that people do this to you, but people like yourself can get taken advantage of it very easily, right? Because you have a want to help animals, right? You have a deep passion for seeing animals, if they're suffering, you want to help them. And it puts you in a position where I'm sure it feels like you're in over your head very quickly.
Yeah, that's been a very difficult lesson to learn. Like when I think back on the last 2 years with the sanctuary, that's probably been the hardest lesson. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had a friend with a sick animal and I've covered vet bills or done rehab for that animal, whatever the case may be. And we've just in the last 6 months really started having to put some guardrails around what we can take in, limit our intakes, limiting some of the species that we could take further. And it's absolutely heartbreaking, because all week long we get these messages of, oh, I'm going to turn my reptile loose, or my animal is dying, or, there's a lot of them are very dramatic and they have a lot of need. And it's particularly hard with this area of rescue because there's not not the funding that you may have for like larger cats and dogs. There's a lot
Mhm.
more government funding for those types of organizations, but it's absolutely heartbreaking not to be able to help every single animal that crosses your path.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, and I think that's a really important point to sort of just sit on for a second because I do see people who have their hearts and their minds are in the right place, and they start to take on animals, and eventually you get to a point where you're actually your quality of life has gone down, and the animals that you're attempting to care for goes. The
Yep.
classic story of a reptile rescue. Sometimes you'll walk in, you'll be like, wow, these animals are on their deathbed because this person has way too much on their plate, and so in terms of like because there are people listening to this podcast who have that mindset, who want to help, and like I said, they're in the right spot. But how do you put up, like, what are some boundaries that you use, or how are you saying no to some animals? Sort of, I guess,
Yeah.
cutting out the emotional side, right?
It's really difficult for me. I actually had to ask my husband and our sanctuary manager to say the no. I could not physically do it, but I said, "Hey, you've got to help me with these guardrails." Like we all sat down, we agreed on what we could do with our board. Like what is our budget support, what is our space support, and we're going to have to adhere to this no matter what that case is. But it is really heartbreaking, and so many rescues go under, within their first year or two. And I saw a post from one last week, and they said, "Oh, we pared back due to medical reasons and our ability, like year and a half ago, 2 years ago." And it was literally a picture of them sitting in their garage with a propane heater because they had their electricity turned off. They pushed it to
Hmm.
the point where they could not afford electricity for themselves. And I think it's that deep love of animals that pushes us all to that level. And we've had some really really rough days where it's like,
Yeah.
who am I going to feed, myself or the reptiles? And that's kind of what led us to some of the guardrails that we have now. But it doesn't make it any less heartbreaking.
Yeah, but it is so necessary, or else
Yeah,
you just collapse on its own weight so quickly,
exactly.
and it's people who are real deep, passionate animal keep people will always choose the animal's welfare over themselves, which is
Yeah,
kind of the sad thing, and then there's also if you play that out for a long term, eventually you'll hit a point where you need to look after your own welfare, or all
yeah.
the animals that are under your roof are not going to have high welfare, but in the moment, it's just the animal eats first.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody says, "Oh my gosh, this animal's dying. I can't afford the vet bills." And I think sometimes when you tell people no, they think, "Oh, it's just because you don't want to do it." Let me try to up the story a little bit and try to manipulate somebody to take in the animal. We see that a fair bit as well, and it's like if we could, we would. Like believe
Mhm.
me, no one who's doing animal rescue is doing it to make money. We're all dirt broke
Exactly.
because of the work. Like if we could help every single animal, we absolutely would.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah, and that's what kind of drives me nuts a little bit about the reptile hobby is so many people, we just, like I said in the intro, we do kind of turn a blind eye to the rescues, and it's almost like an inconvenient truth for many of us. There's an overproduction, there's
yeah,
miseducation, and all this we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's just something that we want to sweep under the rug and we don't want to talk about. And then the individuals like yourself who are actually grinding to just catch all these animals that are at collateral damage, it's as if we just don't even want to look at them. And you guys are doing the work, you're paying the bills, and there's no respect from our side. That's how I feel. I don't know if that's how you feel.
it does feel that way a lot of the time. You know, having done this for a couple years now, there's some observations. For example, like social media posts, the ones that get the most likes are the sob stories. So if we put out a fundraising campaign, for example, we're likely to get little to no traction whatsoever. It's only when you get really in somebody's face with a particular case that you'll see, support for rescues. Um, but it is hard because I think most of the work that's done is, as you said, kind of swept under the rug, and it's just one of those things that people don't want to have to think about. Like, they don't want to think
Mhm.
about the suffering of animals, humans, or whatever that burden is, because as a society, we just want to be happy. We don't want to
Yeah.
deal with the fallout of things as they happen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the history of the organization? Like you said, in 2020, you started it. So you sort of mentioned, how you began it, but why don't you just talk about, that initial, like, let's do this. Was there a moment where you're like, let's create an official organization?
There was. So that was like March-ish of 2021. So last year, we were really full and realized, hey, we can't continue to do this without some support and structure. Like my house, I was literally pulling furniture out. I used to have a lot of plants. There is no, I have no plants in my house at the moment. We don't even have a a living room sofa. Because it's full of rabbits at the moment. But, it got to the point where we're like, if we want to continue to make this impact, we need to have a business structure and a nonprofit around this. So we did become a corporation last March of 2021, and then immediately filed for our 501c3 status, which was approved in July and retrodated back to March. So we knew that to continue the work, we had to create a business, a nonprofit organization that would help support that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is such an important key to have that structure there, because it becomes so overwhelming so fast, and you do need to have something to help hold up all of the mouths that you're feeding.
Exactly. Yeah.
So can you lay out why don't we lay out initially just sort of your goals and the mission with the organization, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the name and whatnot, and then I have some questions from there.
Yeah. So it initially started out as pure rescue, rehab, rehoming. We just wanted to be able to take in animals in need, get them any medical care that they needed, and then get them to their forever home. So when we thought about it, we chose the name Annwn Animal Sanctuary. It's ANNWN. It's an old Celtic Welsh word that actually means land of paradise. It was sometimes called the land of the Fae. But the one common thing that all the stories have is that anyone who was there, animal or human, it was a land of no hunger, no pain. It was very much a paradise, so sort of like Celtic heaven, if you will. And we wanted to be that for animals in need. There were, again, the dog and the cat rescues and SPCA and all those larger organizations, but we saw all these animals in need. You go on Craigslist at any point and you see tons of reptiles and different types of animals that there's just nowhere to take them. So we wanted to be a place of refuge, comfort, food for those animals in need. We also have 3 daughters who love fairies, so it was kind of a double meaning. We wanted to create that paradise for our family and the community as well.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing, and I can't imagine, because you're like you say, when you open up Craigslist or any sort of post-secondary, what do you call them, classifieds, you're going to see an amazing amount of things. So what does it look like on a weekly basis? How many calls are you getting? Are you constantly getting inundated with people trying to surrender animals? How does that work?
We get probably around 10 a week.
Okay.
I will tell you, for a while, we tried to manage it with a wait list. And then about 6 weeks ago, we actually just cut our wait list off and said, hey, you're just going to have to check back with us, check back in 3 months, because it's all week long, every week. Busy weeks might be 15 or 20 surrender requests. Lighter weeks might be 5 to 10. But I'd say on average, probably about 10. There are some people, we try to be a resource in the community. So if there's an animal, we do get wildlife calls. We're not licensed for wildlife, but I can at least send you to the rehabbers who can help. If it's a dog or a cat, obviously that's not our wheelhouse, but we can send you to some resources. So while we started out as a rescue and purely focused on rescue, rehab, and rehoming, we realized very early on that to have a meaningful impact, we wanted to be very, very heavy on education, whether that's community education for resources. We can't help you, but let me get you to somebody who can help you. But also to create awareness around what's happening in the industry. What does it mean to own a pet? Like, we can coach you on the appropriate setup for a bearded dragon. We can give you realistic expectations for what it's going to take. You buy that little 6-inch iguana at the pet store, like that 6-inch iguana is going to turn into a 5-foot beast, So we did, we of course still do rescue, rehab, and rehoming. We've set some realistic numbers for ourselves that we can support. We've focused in on our species a little bit. For example, aquatic turtles is one that we really, really struggle with. And we're moving much more towards education. There's always going to be this floodgate of animals that needs rescue and rehoming. But our goal is really to educate and change that pattern so that when we look forward, 10 or 20 years from now, there's been a meaningful impact for small and exotic animals. And rescuers that come along in 5 or 10 or 20 years don't have some of the struggles that we do. So for that reason, we pivoted into a dual mission of, rescue, rehab, rehome, as well as education.
Mm. Which makes a lot of sense. I mean, I feel like the failures in pet keeping is that education piece. We have our society is too rich, and we are able to, I shouldn't say too rich. Like I don't mean we shouldn't have money, but you have the ability to make a very quick purchase on a dime. You can walk into a pet store and walk out with an animal that you've never heard of, and
Exactly.
clearly that's a problem. And so education is definitely key. Did you notice? This is something that I noticed, or I heard about through a rescue here where I am, that there was a pretty massive spike after COVID. Like there was like I don't know if you've experienced this, but during the COVID lockdowns and whatnot, especially in Canada, they were really intense. So lots of people went out and bought animals. And then as soon as the world started opening back up again, these animals were dumped
Yes.
into rescues. Did you guys experience that as well?
Massive increase. We saw a pretty good flux actually during COVID, because people couldn't afford animals. Either they were
Hmm.
laid off or they had medical issues, or they got a pet and very quickly, like within a couple weeks, realized, hey, this isn't what I can do. So we did see some pretty good spikes during COVID. And then as things started to opening up, that's when we started getting more of the emails. Hey, I'm headed back to work. I don't have any time for this animal. So certainly spikes throughout all of it, but the reason for the spikes has changed a little bit.
Right. That makes sense. And oh yeah, yeah. As far as the reptiles go, is there a few common reasons that people are saying I can't do this anymore? Is it mostly a financial thing? Is it a time thing, or is it just kind of everything?
Um, I would say by and large, probably 70%, just spitballing a number, is I've gotten tired of my pet and I don't want it anymore.
Okay.
It's I'm having a baby and there's no room. My kid's going off to college, can't take the reptile with them. My kids are bored with the pet. It's a lot of parents who got animals for their children and didn't think through like, hey, you're going to have this snake for 20 plus years, or this bearded dragon can live 10 plus years. And basically just generally doesn't fit with their lifestyle anymore. We do take a handful of medical cases, not as many as some rescues. Shout out to one of our rescues in North Carolina, Be Wild. They take a lot of the severe medical cases. They've been in business a little bit longer than we have. Um, but typically owners surrender. We do take in from the county as well, and their reasons are pretty typical. Like people just drop off animals they don't want to care for anymore.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's why I think it's important for people listening to this podcast to hear some of those reasons, because, the message of this show is to help and to push herpetoculture forward.
Mm,
And, listening to some of those reasons, it's like, okay, what can we do as keepers who are responsible keepers who are not going to dump off their animals? What can
yeah.
we do to ensure that this is something that's not going to continue? And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as, education goes. And I want to talk about that in a second, but maybe before we do that, can you just lay out, you said you have an acre of land, and you have rabbits in the living room and whatnot. I don't know if that's still the case, but
It is. Yeah.
so can you tell us just a little bit about the facility and how things are laid out?
Yeah. So we have, pretty common house. It's like 2,500 square feet. Nothing major. Certainly not a mansion. We have one downstairs room that is exclusively reptiles. It is floor to ceiling baker's racks, with anywhere from 10-gallon, 20-gallon, up to some of the larger 4 or 5 foot long stacks. But it is floor to ceiling on every wall reptiles. We have a sunroom dining room area upstairs, which has all sorts of birds as well as mammals like chinchillas and ferrets and sugar gliders. We have an entire wall of aquatics, which encompasses fish and a variety of aquatic frogs. We had a crayfish that just passed away about a week ago, but he lived here for a year and a half, which was pretty impressive for a seafood market rescue, in my opinion.
Mm.
Um, We've had, I don't have any inside at the moment, but we have big 150-gallon turtle tubs. So, like the stock tanks you would get from a feed store. We've had aquatic turtles in the house. My entire upstairs area is filled with racks of chameleon snakes and blue-tongued skink. Uh, we've got multiple dragon stacks, which are like 4 cages tall. One reaches about 10 feet tall in a high ceiling area of our house. So quite literally, any area of the house that's not a bedroom is full floor to ceiling of some kind of rescue animal.
Wow. So
So
how are you managing this? You have your husband, and I think there's a few people that are employees as well or volunteers.
we are very blessed. I think we're one of the only rescues in the area that has paid employees, and we're very fortunate. I do work a day job, so 95% of my salary goes straight to the rescue. We do fund most of the rescue out of pocket and, plan to continue to do so. But we have one full-time sanctuary manager who's here 40 hours a week. We have a couple part-timers who fill in and help. We have a lady that comes and kind of helps with the cleaning and organization because, as we know, mammals and birds and everybody have lots of feathers and fur and stuff like that. And then we have volunteers. So we have volunteers who come from the local colleges, sometimes for community service. We've got, a bunch of locals, but on an average week, we probably have around 20 volunteers, plus myself, my husband, and the employees.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to imagine how busy your house must seem with all, not only the animals, but people coming and going. And I mean, it's amazing, like you said, that you have so many people helping, because that would be, I think, impossible if you didn't. But it must just feel like a revolving door of things happening all the time.
It does. It does. We try to keep Sunday clear. We have one fraternity that comes and will be here this weekend. We're actually building a new mammal room. It's about 19 by 21 feet. We're converting a carport area into a mammal room. So super excited to get that done in the next couple of weeks as winter sets in. But for the most part, we try to keep Sundays open as a family day. But it's a struggle. Like, we have definitely done a lot less as a family since we started this. There's been a lot of personal sacrifice that we really hope will bear fruit as we continue to grow the rescue.
Well, it sounds like you're setting the right foundation, and I mean, it's clearly an incredibly challenging task in order to just stay on top of everything without, feeling overwhelmed. And so, what are some of the main challenges? Is it mostly financial, or are there other things?
Financial, our operating budget is, public since we're a nonprofit, but I think operating costs for this current year will probably hit around 150,000.
Wow.
So, for most rescues, that is a very, very hard number to meet. Even if we took out salaries and kind of support staffs, we'd still be looking at least 60 to 75,000 in operational costs. And that's things like our electric bill is $700 a month.
Right.
We spent upwards of $20,000 in vet bills in the first quarter of this year, which was our entire budget for the year. So, overages on beyond, above and beyond that. Feed, whether it's the bulk orders of frozen feeders for snakes, or it's local pickup at Tractor Supply, or big bug orders from Dubia. We spend at least probably $3,000 a month just to feed animals. So it's an expensive, very expensive hobby. If you're thinking of starting a rescue, it is not cheap. You're not going to make any money at it, but bless anyone who wants to do it. So
Yeah. I mean, I can barely believe that. That is incredible. That I mean, I believe how much money it costs, but it's just amazing that you're able to pull that off and able to keep it floating. And I guess the idea eventually is that there's enough donations that come in to help offset that, right? So you're not constantly having to pay your own salary into running that side of your life.
that's correct. My husband and I take no salary. We never have. We fund we fund 90%, 90 to 95% of the rescue out of our pocket, and that's just our give back. Anyone, as you would donate to any other organization. But, we wanted to be able to do more. And truthfully, our goal is to get to the point where we have a higher level of recognition so we can start making some changes in this industry to, significantly impact how people perceive reptiles and what it means to get a reptile. What is the responsibility of this. So it's worth it for us to do that. But yes, the goal would be that the nonprofit would be self-sustaining. That would be a wonderful day.
So maybe this would be a good point to talk about maybe the rebrand, because I think that's a good jumping off point to discuss sort of the education, how the sanctuary is going to be rebranded over the next couple of weeks, with, I think, that being one of the main goals
Exactly.
of education. Yeah. So go ahead there.
Yes. We are super excited. We are about to go live with our new rebrand. It's called Wild Discovery. Because nobody can pronounce Annwn. That's caused a lot of confusion, even though it has a sweet story behind it. But we really wanted something that could take us bigger. By bigger, I mean, we'll continue to make an impact in our community. We visit nursing homes, we go to schools, we have classes, all those things, and we'll continue to do that. But in order to make a lasting impact in the reptile and exotic animal industry, we need to be able to have a seat at the table to talk to large pet store chains. We need to be able to weigh in on laws and regulations that are taking effect. We need to be able to travel to places where reptiles are being sourced from and say, hey, like, how can we help you maintain your ecological balance by not sourcing wild caught animals?
Hmm.
So our entire goal, of course, will continue local education, rescue, rehab, and rehoming, but is to get to that level of awareness in the community where wild discovery means something. And we can start networking at that different level so we can hopefully have a larger impact in the industry.
And it seems like that goal and the vision of the future is probably the only thing that allows you to do the crazy amount of work and the crazy amount of spending that you have to do right now, right? Without that, I think it would almost be impossible. Like, you have this amazing vision, and I know that will come true for you guys because you're doing all this incredible work now. But without that sort of like star to look forward to, I think it would just become too chaotic. Or maybe I'm wrong there.
No, it absolutely would. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we have thought about calling it quits over the last 2 years, more so in the last year. The first year wasn't too bad. You know, you had a lot of that new business, new rescue kind of energy, and it was all wonderful. But the last 9 months have been really, really hard. And we have had multiple conversations about saying this is enough, we can't do it, because it's a never ending onslaught of need. And no matter what you do, there's always going to be more, and you never feel like you make an impact. And, shout out to our sanctuary manager, Liz. Like, she truly has been a shining star for us since she joined the team about a year and a half ago. And we would not be here today without her help. She is so amazing and just has such a huge heart. And she's helped us through a lot of those times to kind of help keep that focus, because ultimately we've all the rescues, we have got to get to a place where there is some sort of impact in the industry to stop this flood of animals, whether it's cats and dogs in a spay and neuter campaign, or you see similar campaigns with like water bottles, refill your bottle, don't buy the plastic bottle. We're talking about that same kind of societal change for the reptile industry. We've got to be able to figure out what makes that change, so we can all get to a point where we can meet the need in our community, because it's never enough. You ask any rescue, they're all completely underwater, and you're drinking from the fire hose, and it just never stops.
Yeah. So how do you not become extremely resentful over just the reptile hobby in general? Like, I'm sure you see a flyer or an ad for a reptile expo coming up, and that must just if it was me, I would be so frustrated. I don't know how I could move on with knowing how many animals are being entered into the market. And like you said, there's a fire hose coming your direction, and then here's us on the train, and we just don't care. We just keep driving forward.
I'm not going to lie. I am finding myself a little bit more bitter about it some days than others. It's hard because you see the reptile expos, and I'll admit, like, I went to them for years. I've bought animals from reptile expos, and I love my collection of snakes. So I mean, we do rescue and rehab and rehoming, but we have our personal pets, and I love them dearly. And more than one has come from a breeder. So I'm absolutely not bashing that kind of environment. And I think you can have events like that, and you can do them in a safe and sane and professional manner that doesn't hurt the animals and still allows people to, carry on a hobby. And there are so many good people out there who love reptiles. They love keeping them as pets. They love, helping endangered species continue. There's so many wonderful examples of that. And that's what I try to hold on to. If we can give those maybe good's not the right word, but the pet owners who are behaving in a very moral and ethical way, if we can give them the latitude to continue their work while also educating those who are maybe there for the wrong reasons, or they just don't know that they're there for the wrong reasons. There's got to be a balance somehow to, keep the industry running, but also limit some of the overpopulation and overavailability.
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree, and I think maybe the word you're searching for is responsible keepers, and
yes.
It's people like Liz. Liz is a longtime listener of the podcast, and that's how we got connected. And Liz is like an archetype for the people who listen to this podcast, and people who are responsible keepers and want to do things the right way. And like you said, yeah, there's nothing wrong with going to an expo and buying an animal for the people who understand what that means. But there's a whole side of sort of the retail side that just doesn't, it seems like they don't, it doesn't actually care about the animal, and it seems more about the sale, the
Yeah.
selling the $20 leopard gecko, and who cares if it ends up in the hands of someone who doesn't want it in a year and a half. Is there a particular list of common species that you see pop up?
Um, yeah, so after every reptile expo, we inevitably get an influx of surrender requests. Chameleons are probably one of the worst because they're a little bit persnickety to take care of. Snakes that won't eat, ball pythons. We get a lot of ball pythons that just won't eat. And I have yet to have one that we couldn't turn around within a couple weeks with husbandry. Iguanas, we get a lot of iguana requests. That's a really, really hard one because of space constraints. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and to your point, I think there are so many wonderful, responsible breeders out there and responsible owners. And it's just, when you think about the expos, there's those few bad breeders out there who are in it for the money. In my opinion, most of them are out there with like wild caught animals.
Mm-hmm.
They're not domestically breeding. That's one of our big tenets is, know your breeder, know where your animal's coming from. Um, we see so many animals surrendered with genetic issues or organ failure because they're coming from big box breeders. Or we've gotten multiple requests after a convention. There was one surrender request. They got a chameleon at a convention and within 24 hours had to put the chameleon down because it was in such poor condition. That was one
Wow.
specific breeder who was pushing sick animals off on unsuspecting people in the community. So, some of it is community education, but also some of it is ethical breeding standards.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe those breeders don't know what they're doing. In the case with the chameleon, it happened 4 times. So I'd probably say that's not it. And, we need to hold breeders to a higher standard. And if that means us as individuals not buying from them, maybe it means us as individuals saying, hey, this person should not be at a Repticon. They should not be here because of their unethical standards. There's
Yeah.
a couple ways you can come at it.
Well, and when I think of herpetoculture in general, I guess I'm full of analogies today, but I just picture, there's like little, like these incredible groups all over the place, but then we have like little areas where there's just like a raging like dumpster fire. And
Yes.
those are what draws in all the animal rights groups and the government legislation. And like, that's all they see. And I'm sure if they came over to your facility, they might go, all of these animals here are people that didn't want them. Like, what are you guys doing? It wouldn't look good to have a rescue that can barely hang on to,
Yeah.
the requests that come in week to week. And so I think you're completely right. There's things that we need to do. There needs to be a cultural shift in how animals are sold, and maybe it starts with education for sure. But are there certain things that you see that we really need to stop as far as keeping reptiles? Like maybe like in my mind, I think of like large species, or maybe breeding, like poor breeding, like morphs that have genetic issues and whatnot. Are there any of those types of things that you see regularly that we just got to put the brakes on immediately?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this because when we were considering our strategy, like where do we want to make an impact? And is it we want to push for like tighter exotic animal bans in a state, or is it at the pet store level, or is it the Repticon level? Like where could we make a meaningful impact? And I do think there needs to be some sort of effort around pet stores. They're selling animals, they get massive. People don't understand, and the employees at those pet stores don't understand. So there are species that, in my opinion, should not be sold in community pet stores simply because of the care that they require. There's also a lot of smaller breeders. You see this less with the pet store, but for example, the red hypo bearded dragons are very prone to neurological issues, seizures, because of how they've been bred. But ultimately, the reason that they're being bred is because there's demand for that animal, right? So it's we as purchasers of exotic animals, we really have to put our money where our mouth is and stop buying these animals, or there's not going to be a meaningful change, whether it's in private breeders, underground animal market with imports, or pet stores. We as consumers have the power. If we can educate the consumer and say, you don't want this. It's the equivalent of a purse that's made by sweat labor in Indonesia, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If the purchaser of that purse knows what went into it, and that some 9-year-old child died from sweat labor making this purse, are they going to buy it? Hopefully not. It's raising the consciousness of the consumer to have an impact on the suppliers, because we're not going to be able to meaningfully lobby a large pet store and say, hey, stop selling this lizard, because it makes them a profit, right? They don't
Hmm.
care. As long as the profit's there, they're not going to change. So, and I don't want it to be from the legal side of things because, politically, I believe in personal autonomy and the right for responsible reptile breeders to have their reptiles. And I certainly don't want to change that. So for me, it really just has to be, put your money where your mouth is and let's make
Hmm.
some change as consumers. And if you don't realize what your money is going towards, that's the education opportunity. And we need like large scale social media campaigns, awareness campaigns, grassroots guerrilla type campaigns to get that out there.
Yeah, and that's always the issue, right? Because I agree with you as well with the laws. Making black and white laws it rarely works, and typically the laws are written in a way that people get around them anyway, or they just punish the people who are doing the things responsibly. So it just doesn't work. It just sort of backfires on all ends. But I do wonder all the time is how, because as I said with this podcast, I try to get this platform to new keepers, but that is so difficult. Like, how do you get in front of a potential reptile keeper or someone that wants to eventually get into reptile keeping, because they're not necessarily in the fold yet. They're not watching the YouTube videos or following Instagram accounts with reptile folks, but you want to get to them before they walk into Petco or PetSmart or whatever to make that first purchase, but it's such a challenge.
Yeah. Honestly, I would like to partner with the pet stores. I would
Hmm.
like to partner with, PetSmart, Petco and the large pet stores out there and, help them create an educational program for their employees and create the flyers, the care flyers. If you've ever walked into a pet store and seen some of the care flyers, take a look at like what's in those things sometimes.
Yeah.
And I know we all may dicker a little bit about, does a snake go on aspen or wood or bark, dirt, bark, et cetera? Is it solid surface or sand? Like even among the community, we don't necessarily have cohesion. And, we're all probably trying to do the best we can with the knowledge that we have. But, how cool would it to be able to partner with local universities and present peer-based research for what is the best care practice for a particular species, and then take that knowledge to the pet store and say, hey, given this, is this an animal you want to continue selling? Or, how can we help you kind of craft your educational program for your employees and then the people that are buying the animals? And, it takes time, but hopefully that transforms into, gee, maybe we shouldn't be selling alligators in a pet store. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. You'd think.
so you would think, yes.
Yeah, it's. I think that is the key is getting in front of those people and giving them the tools to make the right decisions. Because if you are someone who's totally naive to keeping reptiles, you would see a little baby iguana, like you already said, and take it home and then realize the mistake that you've made. But so in an ideal world, if you could imagine the sanctuary and the rescue in an ideal world where the exotic animal keeping industry or hobby is functioning relatively properly, what purpose would the sanctuary serve? Do you think it would just be medical issues and rare rescues, or because certainly you don't imagine it being a fire hose for its
No.
eternal existence?
There's always going to be need. I took in a 30-year-old aquatic turtle a month or so back because the gentleman that had her for her entire life, he passed away. He was in his 80s, and the wife is like,
Mhm.
I don't know what to do with the turtle. I haven't fed the turtle in 30 years. There's always going to be cases like that. We have several ambassador animals here. We have macaws and chinchillas and a couple boa constrictor and puredoors that were surrendered with medical issues. And we took them in expressly as ambassador animals so that we could educate people about the species and help with that piece. So there's always going to be a need. There's always going to be somebody who unexpectedly loses their job and they're facing foreclosure. There's always going to be a cancer patient who truly loves this animal. And that to me is what rescue should be here for, the unexpected that comes up in life. But it
Mhm.
shouldn't be because you have a baby and you're planning a child and you have a pet snake. Like, you knew you had a pet snake when you
Mhm.
got pregnant. Like, that hasn't changed. Same thing. So the true needs cases are where I would like to support, and then people would have the awareness and the foresight to say, if I'm getting this animal, I'm going to take care of it for life.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's probably the model that rescue should kind of aim towards, is having that deep education model as well, coupled with the need, because like you said, there will always
Exactly.
be a need for reptile or for rescues in some extent. And I actually talked about this in a video I did not that long ago. Is 8 months ago, my wife and I had our first baby, and I was so thankful I only had 6 animals because
Yep.
those first like 2 months, you don't even remember. It's just
It's
chaos. And you're like, hopefully
a
you have
blur.
time to change the waters and whatnot. But I see people with these like 50, 60 animals, and maybe they're in their early 20s, and maybe they're not even in a serious relationship yet. I find it hard to imagine that they will actually be able to sustain that, because
Hmm.
they're not there. They have no idea what they're about to get into if they're going to have a
Exactly.
marriage and kids.
Yep. Well, congratulations on your little one.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful blessing in life. But
Yes,
yes,
it
they
is.
definitely animals and kids all take a lot of time. So it is important to be mindful of like what you can expect in life and what you can handle.
Yeah, and I think part of we have this cultural norm in reptile keeping where having a huge collection is normal and promoted as a good thing, and the more animals you have, the better you are. But at the same time, those animals will end up in a rescue or
Yep.
something. Maybe they'll get sold off to other reptile keepers, but it seems like very thin ice to be standing on.
It truly is. I mean, we've had my largest recent surrender was 14 leopard geckos, which came from a young girl who was breeding them out of her mom's house. And she
Hmm.
moved, and where she moved to didn't allow animals. That's one of the questions we ask on our adoption applications, like, do you rent or do you own? Like,
Hmm.
what's your stability in life? And not that we're, trying to knock anyone down. I mean, we rented till 2.5 years ago. But you do have to be mindful of that. If you move, can you take your animals with you? Or, what's the risk of happening? And, Lord knows I moved back in my parents' house when I was in my early 20s, and it happens, and that's life. And of course, there's going to be cases, and that's what we want to support, the truly unexpected, the things that you can't prepare for. But if you can, as much as possible, be mindful of it when you're getting into
Hmm. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about just the process? So, if
it.
somebody, surrenders an animal, what do you guys do with that animal? Is there a certain amount of time that you keep them to make sure they're healthy, and then how do you go about finding a home for them?
Yep. So we keep all of our intakes in quarantine for at least 30 days. We have an intake form that everybody signs that basically says, I'm surrendering voluntarily. This is my pet. I didn't steal it from my neighbor. This pet has not bit anybody in the last, month. Rabies, think rabies kind of question.
Hmm.
We get as much information as we can. Where did you get the animal from? What's the medical history? What do they like, habitat, feed wise? And then we go into a 30-day quarantine for all animals. We're looking for any medical issues, feeding issues, temperament. Any animals we adopt out, we try to match the animal's temperament really closely to the owner's. Is it, you know, someone who wants a really low key animal or somebody who wants to be chasing an animal around the house? So we do make recommendations for potential adopters based on kind of personality and fit. But absolutely 30 days hard quarantine. That means a room with a shut door. And we have biosecurity precautions in place to not transfer anything if we have an
Hmm.
animal that's sick.
And then when somebody surrenders an animal, is there an expectation that it also goes with a donation, or do you request for a donation, or is it just get the animal off their hands and kind of take it from there?
Our intake form does have a donation area at the bottom where they can do like Venmo, PayPal, cash check. I'll tell you, probably one in every 20 surrenders makes a donation.
Hmm.
Some people will donate very generously and say, here's $100 or $200. I'm so sorry, I can't keep my pet. Like, please put this towards vet bills. And they're obviously very distressed about the loss of their pet. And those are the people we love to help. Um, that said, I mean, we don't get donations for most of them. People are just ready to move on, and they, leave them on the front porch or ditch and go. So.
Yeah. And then as far as the adoption fee, there's, I'm sure, some fee associated with somebody bringing home an animal.
We do. We try to be about 40% of retail. So, like
Okay.
for snakes and lizards, we generally go 40% or more of market. So our bearded dragons and our baseball pythons, we try to do like $40, $50. If it's a specialty morph, I think the most we've ever charged for an adoption is 125, I want to say. We do adopt solo animals as well as animals with habitats. We have a lot of used gear. So anything that we're, quote unquote, selling is target 40% of retail or less.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess a lot of times, well, I don't know. Do most of the times when animals get surrendered, they come with an enclosure, or do you have a lot of times where it's just the animal shows up in a pillowcase or something?
It depends. I'd say it's maybe 50, 60% of the time they come with enclosures.
Okay.
We do try to reuse them as much as possible. We end up with a lot of gear. We actually just did a massive community giveaway. We also take in donations from the pet stores, so like rabbit cages. So we had probably 300 habitats sitting on the side of the road and just said, hey, if you need to upgrade your animal, please come get them, please come take them. Um, but we do try to adopt out with enclosures as much as possible if we have the gear.
Yeah. Yeah, that is incredible. I imagine you guys must. I mean, especially with glass enclosures, they take up so much space too. So if you're constantly getting these like 10 a week, you're going to run out of space almost instantly.
Oh yeah, yeah. We there's almost always some tanks sitting on my curb. Our local aquatic society is usually pretty fond of that. So any we try to get them as much as possible. We don't scrap anything. We try to recycle as much as we can and get them to people who can use them.
So what about these larger species like iguana and whatnot? How do you make sure that those go to a person that's not going to, as soon as it grows to its full size, make its way back to you? Is it just going through that application process, or do you try to make sure that if you're giving away a bigger species or adopting out a bigger species, that it goes to somebody with experience? Or
It's a little bit of both. So the largest species we typically see are like sulcata tortoise, an iguana, reticulated python. Truthfully, we've only had one retic. We try to stay away from the retics, particularly if they're larger. So we have a baby right now for adoption that we would want to, certainly go through the application and be like, how big the snake is going to get, and you're prepared for a cage the size of your bedroom. Like, what's your experience with retics? Iguanas, truthfully, we have not had a whole lot of luck rehoming them. We have two here right now. And then the last one that we had in rehab passed away. Fresh Start is another rescue near us in North Carolina. They have tons of iguanas, and I I would not be surprised if they didn't adopt more than one a year because of criteria
really?
to adopt those iguanas. Yeah, they're wonderful rescue, but their adoption page is quite literally full of iguanas, and they cannot move them. I believe they have since stopped taking in iguanas just because they can't find anybody to take them in. With the tortoises, the last pair of sulcatas we adopted out, the woman had over a 1 acre yard that was fully fenced. So
Mm,
we had tons of applications, but we had to be very specific. Like, that you're going to have this tortoise for like 90 years, right? They live
yeah.
a really long time. We have a larger sulcata that's our personal pet, and he is in our will, as are some of the parrots. So these are animals and species that are going to last a really long time.
Yeah,
Hard.
that's a really good point. And
Yeah.
the episode that's coming out before the episode of this episode talks about that, talks about, how to add animals into your will and whatnot. And that's one of the major issues with reptiles in general is they have such long lifespans that regardless of how good of a quality a keeper you are, there's a chance that it'll outlive you, and it's going to need to
Hmm.
have a place to go. And hopefully rescues are quite often the last step. Hopefully you have somebody else in line that can take it before going to fill up a spot in a rescue, if you can avoid it.
Exactly. Well, our vision is hopefully Wild Discovery will continue to grow, and we'll have a legacy of a nonprofit organization that has a lot of legs on it by the time we go anywhere. I've got a few more decades of raising Cain in the industry before we hopefully have to deal with that. But it is definitely a consideration. It's hard.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that's why I'm so impressed with the model and the vision that you have. And I think that any rescue who's listening to this, who's struggling, I think, even though it sounds stressful to take on a much larger vision, it's like we said earlier, it's so necessary. And I think it's the
Yeah.
answer to helping correct this issue. Like we can correct this issue in all sorts of different facets, whether it's, the rescues doing education or the consumers not
Hmm.
purchasing animals that they don't need. And, there's a cascade of different things that we can do. But for anyone that's in a rescue situation who's, being inundated with animals, having that vision of having an organization that can stand on its own and promote better care and try to correct some of these issues, I think is necessary.
Exactly. And no matter what your size, there's so much you can do. In my day-to-day job, I work in software development. I work with a lot of startups and a lot with e-commerce and social media. And quite literally, no matter the size of your rescue, we all have access to social media platforms,
Hmm.
tons of them: Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. YouTube, and every piece of content that you put out there, whether it's, did you know a bearded dragon needs this, or did you know a retic gets this big? Like every piece of social media content, that is the fastest avenue for us to reach the most people all around the globe. And it literally costs us nothing to create. So even if you feel like, man, I'm drinking from the fire hose, I can't do anything, it's this never ending onslaught, I would really encourage you to like get comfortable with a level that you can support. Don't burn out. Somebody told me that when I opened my rescue, and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to burn out. We got this. I'm like, yeah, we're kind of burning out. Like we had to get to a point where we could sustain it, not only for our health, but for the health of the animals.
Mhm.
But there's so much else that you can do. It doesn't take any, it doesn't take any money. You can create a social media post with just a couple of minutes, and every little piece of information that we can share that can slowly transform the industry and make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. So do you have time to sleep? How do you do all this? You're working a full-time day job doing what sounds like relatively complicated work, and then having your off
Yeah,
time is feeding animals.
I have to say, without Liz, we couldn't do it. When I said we would have shut down 100 times over, I really meant it. She keeps the sanctuary running. It's the heart and soul of it. Um, I don't honestly know how people do it without help. Um, I can't believe rescues that have been running on, just volunteers, because even volunteers are, of course, a tremendous help. But just to coordinate a volunteer that comes in for 2 hours, you may have an hour of pre work, coordinating times with them, vetting that volunteer, getting them to go through a volunteer application, and then dealing with the liability of somebody else on your property. So
Mhm.
just, hey, let's throw 100 volunteers at it isn't a simple task. Um, going to find donations takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of work. So it's very hard. I think we've been able to ramp up a little quicker than some other sanctuaries, but all I can say is like just do what you can, because even a couple hours a week is going to be better than nothing, and grow at your pace, no
Mhm.
matter what that means for you. And we did, before we hired Liz, my husband and I, we'd get off work at 5 o'clock, we'd scramble to feed the kids, and we'd immediately feed all the animals, and we were up to 11 or 12 every night. It was 8 hours of work just for the basic care
Mhm.
of the animals that we had at that time. And we literally had no life. We didn't take a family vacation. We did nothing
Mhm.
um, for that time period. And it was rough.
Yeah, and obviously not sustainable. So I think
No,
those are good tips. A, find good quality help.
yeah,
B, don't burn out. And
exactly.
C, have a vision of education. Like there are small things that you can do on a day-to-day basis that aren't going to tax you as much as, taking in a
Correct.
new animal, but will eventually help.
Yeah. And I've always hung on to the fact that like even one life saved is worth it. Even if we called it quits today, we've still made a meaningful impact in the lives of over, I don't even know what we've had, at least 600 or 700 animals in the last 18 or so months.
Hmm.
We've made a meaningful impact in those animals. And, we've lost a couple, but I can at least say they died in somebody's hands, and they were comfortable and they were loved and they had pain meds. That's the bad side of rescue.
Hmm.
But, if you can change the life of one animal, one individual, help them see things differently, it's like the, butterfly effect. You never know what that ripple is going to create. And I hope we create a difference in the lives of those we work with every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get an animal back to health, and you get it adopted out to a person who could be the next, great herpetologist, or somebody who's gonna, be a lawyer to help defend laws and freedom of keeping, or be someone who's gonna study husbandry. I mean, there are a
Exactly.
million different things that who knows what kind of passion that you can spark by making sure an animal ends up in the right hands. And maybe just to kind of wrap up, I don't want to wrap up on a too negative note, but maybe we could. I'm kind of curious to see what some of the worst case scenarios you've seen as far as surrenders coming in, and then maybe we can finish off with some of some nicer
Yeah.
stories. But I'm sure you've seen some kind of dark scenarios.
Um, I think that the two worst that come to mind, one was a chameleon that was bought at a local reptile show. They tried to treat the reptile at home. We never got a conclusive diagnosis, but we're reasonably certain it was yellow fungus. So by the time we got the chameleon, it had eaten through to its spine, and
Oh.
his entire back portion, was not movable, and we immediately had to euthanize. That one was horrific. The other one was a leopard gecko that came in with severe MBD, and by severe MBD, I mean all of their legs were literally broken. I mean, every arm bone, finger bone, everything was just broken and distorted because it had leached all the calcium out of the bones. And of course, it was an immediate euthanization case. So I would say, if in doubt, please reach out to a rescue. Like if you feel like you truly cannot care for your animal, at the very least, I guarantee you no rescue is going to turn away somebody who wants education. Like, what can I do for this animal? What can I do better? Is this a case that needs to go to the vet? We are all going to be able to give you that time, and hopefully help save the suffering of that animal.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of people are intimidated to go ask a vet or post something on Facebook and get lit up. And yeah, if you're just looking for some advice, I'm sure
Yeah,
most rescues are willing to point you in the right direction anyway.
absolutely. Yeah, and we'll of course help and take in as many as we can, but
Hmm.
there's a lot of them.
Yeah, of course. And then are there any positive stories? I mean, I'm sure every animal that comes out comes through the entire system by being surrendered and then adopted out is a positive story. But are there any ones that stick out?
Yeah, I have to tell you, one of my favorite animals. His name is Bruiser. We think he's probably about a 20-year-old iguana. He was found wandering in somebody's front yard in Wake Forest, about an hour from here. Made his way to a local pet store. I just happened to stop in and talk to the pet store owner, and he is the sweetest iguana ever. Like, it's amazing when you get an animal in that's aggressive. Or I had a green cheek conure that was surrendered for biting the snot out of her owner's back. And the only thing with the green cheek was he wants attention. Like if you if you give him the love and attention, he'll sit there and cuddle on you and groom you all day. And same thing with the iguana. Like once they're in a comfort zone and that animal blossoms and opens up, and you're like, wow, this is such an amazing creature. Those are the ones that I try to hold on to. The animal that nobody wanted, that we got to eat or to socialize or to, recover from this horrific medical thing. We're treating a blue-tongued skink at the moment that got bit by a cat, had this horrible respiratory infection with skin and bones, losing a ton of weight. And we're finally getting some weight back on this lizard.
Mhm.
Those, when you have those success stories, are probably my favorite. And it takes forever. With reptiles, their rehab time is months versus weeks, like it could be for another animal. So
Right.
it's definitely the long game, but those are the good ones.
Yeah, and you need those stories in order to just keep mentally going, I'm sure.
Exactly. Exactly.
And just my last question for you is what you mentioned that you do have some personal pets, and I think you mentioned the one sulcata. What other things do you guys have that you classify as your actual pets?
We have a couple cats, one of whom is special needs. She's a Wobbles kitten. We also have two dogs, a collie and a German Shepherd. We unfortunately lost our Saint Bernard 2 days ago. We'd had him for over a decade.
Mm,
Just absolutely broke my heart. So I'm still recovering a little bit this week.
yeah.
But we do have, my husband's an avid snake lover, so he has three personal snakes that are his. They do join us for our ambassador educational programs. I have a bird, that green cheek conure I was telling you about, that was a real biter, has bonded very closely with me. So that Mel's never going anywhere. Mel's staying here. We have two bearded dragons that kind of started the rescue for us. So we have a few, but yeah.
Yeah. A few in a sea of other animals.
Yes, yes, undoubtedly. Very true.
Well, Grace, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know, like you said, it's been a tougher week for you this week, so I appreciate you taking the time today to talk about this, and I especially appreciate the amount of work that you're doing because, as I said a couple of times in the show, the rescues are our safety net that we absolutely need, and we need to show them more respect, and anybody that's listening, if there's a way that you can help your local rescue, please do that because we do need them, and we want to start working on not needing them to the same extent. Like you said, we'll always need rescues, but we don't want them to be struggling to just stay afloat, and to all these personal sacrifices and whatnot that you've already mentioned to the show is really admirable. So thank you so much for that. Can you let everybody know where they can find you online, any social media website, and if anybody wants to make a donation, where might they do that?
Yep. Our website is annwnanimalsanctuary.org. That probably won't change for a couple weeks while we get through the rebrand. We're also Annwn Animal Sanctuary on Facebook. On TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, we're at Annwn's Animals. So we would love to hear from you, and Like I said, honestly, the biggest way a lot of people can help is just to share. Like, please share on social media. If you're a rescue, create your own content. The more awareness we can get out there, the better. So any shares, shout outs are all very much appreciated.
And then during the rebrand, will all those social media sites just change to the Wild Discovery, or are there going to be new accounts that are going to get made?
Everything will be transitioned over. So
Okay.
if you give us a like on anything that's under Annwn's Animals, ANNWNS, Annwn's Animals or Annwn Animal Sanctuary, everything will transition over to the new name as soon as we're ready to go.
Okay, perfect. So if anyone's listening, I'm not sure when this will be out, so it may have already happened. Either way, I'll make sure the show notes are up to date and everybody will have access to those links. And again, thank you so much, Grace. This was an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dylan. I really appreciate it and all you're doing.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Grace, thank you so much for joining me. I know your schedule is super busy, and the fact that you were able to carve out 80 minutes in the middle of your day, I was really grateful for that. And I think I can speak on behalf of everybody in the herpetoculture community and all the listeners. We want to thank you and your husband and Liz for taking on such a gargantuan challenge and just facing it full front and trying to figure out a way to make this work without having our privilege of caring for these animals taken away. I thought that was pretty amazing that you aren't super cynical about pet keeping at this point, because I feel like I would. But the challenge to the listeners is, let's come up with ways that we can help this situation, because Grace is one example of many. There are many rescues all around North America, all around the world probably, that have similar issues when it comes to volume of animals. And there are things that we can do, whether that's helping educate other keepers, maybe going to a pet store and maybe handing out care sheets, or something to do with reducing the amount of impulse purchases and really helping new reptile keepers understand the commitment of what it means to keep a reptile. And I think that message is missed right now. So we can do that. We can help that situation. And hopefully over the next 2 years, we can start seeing a dwindling of unwanted animals. Like we said throughout the podcast, there's always going to be a situation where someone, even if it's the most responsible breeder or keeper of all time, there's a situation where they might have to get rid of their animals, and rescues may step in that scenario, but we don't want them to be utilized as much as they are. If you're looking for more information on this podcast or any other, make sure you head to the show notes at animalsathomenetwork.com. If you would like to join us on the Discord or on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. There you can chat with other keepers, and we do have a live Zoom call, usually about once a month or every 6 weeks or so. And we just chat reptiles. It's a great time. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring the podcast. If you're looking for a new reptile enclosure, make sure you head to the link in the show notes or the description on YouTube. That is an affiliate link, so if you make a purchase, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And really the best and easiest way you can support the podcast is just by sharing it on social media, either Facebook or Twitter, if anyone uses Twitter these days, or Instagram. That's really the best way to just get the show on more ears and eyes, and that really does help me out a lot. And I think that is it for this week. I will catch you guys in the next episode.